Prince William and Catherine confirmed that Prince Louis had struggled emotionally while watching his mother undergo cancer treatment. Behind the cheerful public photograph,
The palace released no statement that morning. There were no cameras waiting at the gates, no headlines drafted in advance. What happened inside the Ashworth family that week never reached the public at all, and that, in the end, was exactly the point. Prince Edmund of Calderwood was 7 years old, the youngest of 3 children born to Crown Prince Alaric and Princess Marielle. He was the kind of child who noticed everything and said almost nothing about it. While his older siblings, Prince Tobias and Princess Wren, filled rooms with noise and opinions, Edmund watched. He watched his mother's hands when she thought no one was looking. He watched the way his father's jaw tightened before he spoke to reporters. He watched doors, which ones stayed open, which ones quietly clicked shut. The illness had arrived 8 months earlier, though no one used that word around Edmund at first. His parents called it mummy's treatments, a phrase soft enough to slide past a child's questions. Marielle had cancer, discovered during what was supposed to be a routine check before a state visit to Portugal. The visit was cancelled. So were a dozen other things, one by one, until Edmund's whole world had quietly rearranged itself around appointments no one explained. At first he asked, "Where is Mummy going? When will she be back? Why is the car waiting so early?" His questions were met with gentle, incomplete answers. "Soon, darling, not long, just a checkup," spoken in the particular tone adults use when they want a conversation to end rather than continue. Edmund was young, but he understood tone before he understood words. He learned quickly that his questions made the room go quiet in a way that felt like punishment, so he stopped asking. What he did instead was watch, and what he watched frightened him more than any honest answer could have. He began keeping track, in the private ledger of a child's mind, of how tired his mother looked at breakfast, how many days in a row she left before he woke, whether she finished her tea or let it go cold. He noticed that the housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Pell, lowered her voice whenever he entered the kitchen. He noticed that his father, usually calm to the point of dullness, had started pacing the long gallery late at night, alone, when he thought his children were asleep. Edmund was not asleep. He had taken to sitting at the top of the stairs, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the murmur of his parents' voices behind the study door. He couldn't make out most of it. But one night, through the gap beneath the door, 2 phrases reached him clearly enough to lodge themselves permanently in his chest. "We have to be prepared, and there's no way to know for certain." A 7-year-old does not have the vocabulary for prognosis, or remission, or the ordinary uncertainty that runs through any serious illness. What he had instead was fear, and fear filled in the blanks his parents had tried so carefully to leave empty. In his mind, prepared meant something final. No way to know meant the worst was not just possible, but likely. He carried those 2 phrases up to bed like stones in his pockets, and he did not tell anyone he had heard them. For weeks afterward, Edmund became, by every outward measure, a wonderfully easy child. He stopped asking difficult questions. He smiled more at meals. He complimented his mother's cooking even when she hadn't cooked, praised her dresses, laughed loudly at jokes that weren't especially funny. Marielle, exhausted and grateful, mistook this for resilience. She told her husband, with real relief, that Edmund seemed to be coping better than she'd feared. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Edmund had built a private theory. If he could keep his mother happy, keep the house cheerful, keep nothing sad ever reaching her, then whatever the 2 frightening phrases meant might not come true. He had turned himself into a small, exhausting engine of reassurance, and he was doing it entirely alone. The performance cracked on an ordinary Tuesday. Marielle had a hospital appointment that ran long. Nothing unusual, simply extra tests that took extra time, and by the time she returned, dusk had settled over the house. She found Edmund sitting fully dressed in the front hall in his school uniform, though school had ended hours before. He hadn't eaten dinner. He wouldn't say why he was there. When she crouched down to him, he finally spoke, and his voice had none of the practiced cheer he'd been wearing for weeks. "You said you'd be back before it got dark," he said. "You said soon." Marielle opened her mouth to reassure him, and stopped, because she saw something in his face she hadn't let herself see before. Not disappointment, but terror, small, contained, and very old for a boy his age. That evening, after Tobias and Wren had gone to bed, Marielle and Alaric sat with Edmund in his room, and for the first time, they simply asked him what he was afraid of, instead of telling him not to be. It took a long silence before he answered. When he finally spoke, it was to repeat, almost word for word, the two phrases he'd heard through the study door months before. Alaric went still. He recognized his own voice in the sentence his son had just recited back to him and understood, in that moment, exactly how those careful late-night conversations, the ones meant to protect the children by keeping them out of the room, had reached Edmund anyway, stripped of context and reshaped by a frightened imagination into something far worse than the truth. What followed was not a single dramatic conversation, but a slow, deliberate change in how the family spoke to one another. Marielle and Alaric stopped having the difficult conversations behind closed doors and started having simpler, honest ones at the kitchen table, in language their children could hold on to. They explained in plain terms what the treatment was actually for, what no way to know for certain really meant not a verdict but the ordinary uncertainty of medicine, and why adults sometimes used careful words that could sound frightening out of context. Edmund did not stop being afraid overnight. Fear like his doesn't dissolve the moment the truth arrives. It loosens gradually, replaced bit by bit with something more like trust. But he did stop keeping his private ledger. He started asking questions again, and this time, his parents answered them, even when the answers were hard. Marielle began telling him plainly when she was tired instead of hiding it, and, just as importantly, telling him when she felt hopeful, so he had more to hold on to than just her exhaustion. One evening, weeks later, Edmund asked if he could come along to one of her hospital visits, not to understand the medicine, he said, but just to see where she went, so it would stop being a mystery. Marielle agreed. He sat quietly in a corner of the waiting room, watching nurses move between doors he'd once imagined as frightening and unknown, and found, to his own surprise, that an ordinary room with ordinary people in it was far less terrifying than the one he'd built in his head. Princess Wren, older and sharper than her brother, later admitted she'd noticed the toy soldiers Edmund had started leaving outside their mother's door, small offerings, as though loyalty and good behavior might function as a kind of protection spell. She never told anyone at the time. She hadn't known what it meant, only that her little brother seemed to be trying very hard at something no one had asked him to try at. Alaric, for his part, carried his own quiet reckoning. He had believed, in the way many parents do, that steadiness meant never letting his children see him unsettled, that calm was itself a form of protection. What he came to understand was that his calm, unexplained, had simply become another closed door for Edmund to stand outside of, straining to hear what was too frightening to be said aloud. Real steadiness, he realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was staying present with his children inside it. Tobias, 12 and often preoccupied with his own world, surprised everyone by becoming a quiet anchor for his younger brother in the weeks that followed. He started inviting Edmund to sit in on his homework, not because he needed help, but because he'd noticed Edmund lingering near closed doors and wanted to give him somewhere else to be. He never mentioned their mother's illness directly. He simply made space, and Edmund, without quite realizing why, began to feel less like he was standing guard over the house and more like an ordinary younger brother again. Wren, meanwhile, finally told Edmund she'd seen the small toys and drawings he'd left outside their mother's door. Instead of teasing him, she admitted she'd once done something similar as a much younger child, during a different frightening year, and hadn't known how to explain it either. Hearing that his private ritual wasn't strange, that someone else in his family had once carried a version of the same fear, loosened something in Edmund that months of reassurance from the adults around him hadn't quite reached. There was no grand public announcement in the Ashworth family, because there didn't need to be. The change that mattered happened at breakfast tables and school-run car rides and quiet bedtime conversations, ordinary moments made honest instead of carefully managed. Marielle's treatment continued, with its good weeks and difficult ones, but the family's way of living through it had changed shape entirely. Months later, watching his mother laugh freely at something Tobias had said, Edmund realized he'd stopped studying her face for warning signs. He was simply watching her laugh, the way any child watches a parent they trust will still be there tomorrow. The fear didn't vanish completely. It rarely does, for any family living through illness, but it no longer lived in silence. And that, more than any reassurance, was what let a 7-year-old boy finally put down the stones he'd been carrying alone.